Section: Introduction. In this section, we describe our thought preference optimization (TPO) method, which helps large language models (LLMs) think before responding. We begin with a standard instruction-tuned LLM that typically gives a response right after receiving user instructions. Since we don't have labeled thought data for fine-tuning, we face a challenge in training. To kickstart our training, we prompt the model to generate its thought process followed by its response for each user instruction. By sampling multiple outputs, we then use preference optimization to enhance the quality of these thoughts and their corresponding responses based on the response's quality. For generating thoughts, we aim for a straightforward approach that fits within existing LLM frameworks. We maintain the model's architecture as an autoregressive transformer, which can work with any model that produces a sequence of tokens. During inference, the output consists of two parts, the thought and the response, both in natural language. Instead of sending the entire output to the user, we preprocess it to separate these parts and only share the response. Initially, we prompt the model to articulate its thought process, using specific formats that include fixed keywords to help us identify where the response begins. While the training will refine the types of thoughts generated, the initial thoughts are crucial as they provide a foundation. We use a more generic thought prompt that allows the model flexibility, as well as a more specific prompt that requires the thought to include a draft response and its evaluation. This specificity gives us better control over the thoughts but requires expertise in what types of thoughts are beneficial for LLMs. We keep the thought part hidden from the user, only providing the response. This sets our method apart from chain of thought (COT) prompting, where reasoning steps are often included in the response. While COT can be useful for tasks like math problems, users generally prefer concise answers without excessive reasoning. By concealing the thought part, we allow it to take various forms that may not interest the user, such as making mistakes or drafting responses. However, we can offer an option to reveal the thought part for interpretability and analysis of the reasoning behind the response. The thoughts can be in any form, not necessarily natural language, but we choose to use natural language because it leverages human-written data and allows for easier inspection of the model's behavior. To optimize the thoughts generated, we recognize that our initial prompting does not yield thoughts that effectively enhance the responses. Often, these thoughts perform worse than direct responses from instruction-tuned LLMs. Therefore, we need to train our model to better utilize thought generation. We adopt the reinforcement learning from AI feedback (RLAIF) approach, where we generate outputs from the model and rank them using a reward model that evaluates the responses. We specifically use iterative direct preference optimization (DPO) for its simplicity and effectiveness. Unlike traditional RLAIF, our judge only sees the response part, ensuring that the thought part does not influence its evaluation. This choice is driven by the difficulty of creating a judge model that can assess internal thoughts and the need to focus on improving user responses. Our training begins with a seed model that is instruction-tuned for direct responses. We also require a dataset of user instructions to start the training process. In each training iteration, we provide the current model with instructions and our thought prompt, generating outputs that include both thoughts and responses. Section Summary. In this section, we introduce our Thought Preference Optimization (TPO) method, which trains LLMs to generate a thought process before responding, using preference optimization to enhance the quality of thoughts based on response effectiveness. We maintain the model's autoregressive architecture and employ a structured prompting approach to separate thoughts from responses, ultimately optimizing the model's performance through reinforcement learning from AI feedback (RLAIF), while keeping the thought process hidden from users. Section: Building Preference Pairs. In this section, we describe how we build preference pairs. After we extract the response parts, we input them into the judge model for scoring. For judge models that evaluate a single response, the process is straightforward. We get a score for that response. We also look at judge models that compare pairs of responses to determine a winner. We apply the judge model to all possible pairs of responses, including swapping their positions to minimize any bias from their order. Once we identify the winners from these pairs, we convert them into individual scores using LO scoring. We then select the highest and lowest scoring responses as our chosen and rejected samples to create a preference pair, which includes both thought and response components. This helps the model learn which thought process led to a better response. Next, we move on to iterative training. With our preference pairs ready, we use them along with the DPO loss to train our current model. This results in a new model for the next training round. We avoid using data from previous iterations, assuming it is of lower quality. Additionally, we experiment with the IRPO loss, which combines DPO with the NLL loss. We also address length control, as some judge models tend to prefer longer responses, leading to verbosity. To counter this, we implement a length control mechanism. We define a normalization function to adjust scores by penalizing longer responses. A hyperparameter controls the strength of this length control, ensuring that both scores and lengths are on a similar scale. For our setup, we use Llama 3 to 8B instruct as our seed model. We consider two judge models, Self-Taught Evaluator, STE, and ARMO-RM. STE is based on Llama 3 to 70B instruct and provides preferences in natural language after generating a chain of thought. ARMO-RM is a reward model that gives a scalar score for a single response. Initially, we use synthetic instructions for training, generated from Llama 2 to 70B chat. Later, we switch to ultra feedback, which contains real human instructions. Each training iteration involves 5,000 new instructions, and we generate 8 responses per prompt. We train for 10 epochs and select the best model based on a validation set. We typically set the length control parameter between 0 and 0.5, with 0 meaning no control. Unless stated otherwise, we use the thought prompt trained with the ARMO-RM judge on ultra feedback as our default. As a baseline, we also train the same seed model to produce responses directly, allowing us to measure the impact of thought processes on response quality. For evaluation, we utilize 2 public benchmarks that assess general instruction following abilities, along with our own benchmark for detailed analysis. Section Summary. In this section, we describe our process for building preference pairs by scoring responses with a judge model, selecting the highest and lowest scores to identify chosen and rejected samples, and using these pairs to train our model iteratively with DPO loss while mitigating length bias through a length control mechanism. We also outline our experimental setup, including the use of specific judge models and training data, to evaluate the impact of thought processes on response quality. Section: Alpaca Eval Results. In this section, we present the results of our model, TPO, which achieves a highest win rate of 52.5%. This is an improvement of 4.1% over the direct baseline and a 27.6% increase compared to the seed model, placing us in third on the leaderboard, just behind GPT-4 Omni and GPT-4 Turbo. This is notable considering our model's smaller size of 8 billion parameters. In our training iterations, we observe that the direct baseline performs better before training begins, as expected, since the seed model is specifically tuned to provide responses. Interestingly, prompting the model to articulate its thought process initially reduces performance, aligning with previous findings that such prompting mainly benefits math and logic tasks. However, after several training iterations, TPO begins to match and then surpass the baseline, particularly in the third and fourth iterations, indicating that the model is learning to leverage its thoughts to enhance responses. For the Arena Hard benchmark, we see similar trends. Initially, the seed model's performance is low, but with more training, it matches and eventually outperforms the baseline, achieving a win rate of 37.3%, which is 4.3% better than the baseline. This positions our model as the top performer on the leaderboard despite its smaller size, comparable to larger models like GPT-4 and Mistral Large. To gain deeper insights, we created our own evaluation using ultra feedback, categorizing instructions not used in training into 20 groups, each with 200 samples. We compared responses from our TPO model to those from the direct baseline, using prompts from Arena Hard and GPT-4 for evaluation. Our findings reveal that non-reasoning categories, such as language and marketing, show significant improvement through thinking, alongside reasoning categories like research and math. We also conducted qualitative analyses to better understand TPO. For instance, we illustrate how thinking can enhance tasks like poetry writing, which typically isn't seen as a reasoning task. We provide examples of the model's thought process, showing how it evaluates its responses. We compared different thought prompt types and found that while the seed model struggles with generating thoughts, this gap narrows after just one training iteration. Although the win rates between thought prompt types are similar, the specific thought prompts lead to longer responses and higher evaluation scores. Regarding thought lengths, we noted that specific prompts generate longer thoughts as they require the model to draft and evaluate responses. Over training, the model learns to condense its thoughts, reducing their length significantly after 4 iterations. We also analyzed thought lengths by category, finding that areas like research and writing tend to have longer thoughts, while categories like conversation and math are shorter. Section Summary. In this section, we present our model TPO, which achieves a win rate of 52.5% in Alpaca Eval, outperforming the baseline and demonstrating significant improvement after several training iterations. Additionally, our fine-grained evaluation reveals that thinking enhances performance across various instruction categories, including both reasoning and non-reasoning tasks. Section: Length Control. In this section, we discuss length control, LC, and its importance during training, particularly with the STE judge. We observe that without LC, the average response length increases significantly. For example, after just one training iteration of the direct baseline, the average response length rises by about 15%. By applying our LC technique when creating preference pairs, we can keep the response length stable or even reduce it if needed. We adjust the LC coefficient by comparing the average lengths of accepted and rejected samples, selecting the smallest value that ensures the accepted length does not exceed the rejected length. This straightforward approach proved effective, as both the TPO and direct baseline models maintained their response lengths during training. We also explore 2 training instruction sets: a synthetic set generated by few-shot prompting Llama 2 to 70B and ultra feedback, which consists of human instructions. Our findings, as shown in the relevant tables, indicate that there is not a significant difference in final performance between these datasets. Additionally, we test 2 judges, ARMO-RM and the Saint Judge, and find that TPO consistently outperforms the direct baseline on Alpaca Eval with either judge. However, we note that the STE judge requires more length control during training, and we achieve better results with the ARMO-RM judge. Regarding parsing errors, we initially use prompting to ensure the output format separates thoughts and answers. However, we notice that without extra measures, the rate of parse errors fluctuates and is difficult to manage. To help the model adhere to the constraints, we include responses with parse errors as rejected examples in our preference data. Typically, parse errors account for no more than 10% of rejections per iteration, but we find it challenging to control this for specific prompt templates. We discover that resampling when a parse error occurs helps mitigate the issue during evaluations. We also compare DPO and IRPO loss during training. While we implement DPO loss, we experiment with IRPO loss, which has shown promise in math tasks. IRPO incorporates a negative log likelihood loss on chosen samples to prevent a decrease in their average log probability, a potential issue with DPO. However, our experiments reveal no significant performance difference. After one training iteration, TPO using IRPO achieves a 31.6% win rate on Alpaca Eval LC, closely matching the 32.0% from DPO using the STE judge and synthetic dataset. To further investigate performance in the math domain, where chain-of-thought techniques are often applied, we evaluate our model on the GSM-8K dataset, which contains grade school math word problems. Since we have the correct answers, we can measure performance more accurately. Initially, we test the seed model without a thought prompt and find it still uses chain-of-thought reasoning, achieving 79.2% accuracy. We then modify the problems to instruct the model to provide only the numerical answer, and it performs surprisingly well, reaching 69.7% accuracy. However, we notice that the seed model still engages in chain-of-thought like arithmetic in its outputs. After training direct models on synthetic prompts and the St. Judge, accuracy drops to 51.3%, with even lower performance for TPO models. This suggests our experimental setup is not ideal for math tasks, as only 2.2% of our training instructions fall into the math category. We also observe that while the TPO model can correct its mistakes through reflection, the direct model tends to stop at errors. For more detailed results, we refer to the appendix.